Hello, and welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. When you look at television today, sometimes you can find a certain program that you like, and maybe some networks will carry it all the time. In the case of NBC, three particular different versions of Law and Order certainly made people see crime and murder and justice being served an extremely enjoyable thing. Then, of course, through syndication, networks like TNT, USA, and other locations, if you do it all right, you could actually watch one brand of show nearly an entire day, within an entire day, which would be pretty impressive. But looking at Virginia's history, we have discovered that certainly there has been quite a bit of murder and crime, law, order, justice, everything you can imagine. And so it's on that note that we have today's episode, looking at certainly the sensationalized idea of murder, but crime as well, and the law and order justice that goes through to try to bring these heinous criminals to justice. And so joining me today is co-host Charles Mills, author and historian, and so let's delve into it. What of crime and law and order?
Well, when you think of the colonial period and the Virginia of Washington and Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, one word never comes into your mind, and that is murder. But there was evil under the sun, even then. Take, for example, a murder that we never even consider. It wasn't really a crime of passion, but it was so widespread that in 1710, the Virginia Assembly passed a special law against it. And do you know what that was?
No clue.
It was the murder of illegitimate children. Because in those days, pregnancy was always the fault of the woman. The man was always scot-free. Even if it was a case of rape, a servant woman would say, I've been raped by my master, and she would be punished for ruining his reputation. So a pregnant woman in colonial times was pretty much on her own if she was having an illegitimate child. And unfortunately, that led to the murder of a lot of illegitimate children and the passage of that law by the Assembly in 1710.
Well, it's always interesting to think about that topic because if you look at the Revolutionary War time period, it's very common to see a lot of young women who, as the adage would go, she and her soon-to-be husband would often beat the preacher to the bedroom, and that she would already be pregnant by the time she got married. And so it's very unique to think that this particular topic would be occurring, especially since it's very rarely ever mentioned in the historical record for most people to learn about.
Yes. Well, that's why it's interesting to find this law on the books. But most of the murders in colonial Virginia really came about because of the institution of slavery. I mean, you had millions of slaves who were, pretty much living in the sufferance of their masters. And some of these masters were, pretty hard cases. So slaves had three basic ways of resisting bad masters: running away, arson, and poisoning. And the one that was really feared by the masters was poisoning, because you had slaves cooking the food and washing the clothes, and you might have slaves living in the house. And, these fears weren't groundless, because 180 slaves were actually tried and executed during colonial period, 180.
Now, when it comes to slaves poisoning their master, how frequent would this be?
Well, as I say, you had 180, but the poisoning wasn't just between masters and slaves, or, slaves poisoning masters. Most of the poisoning was actually slave on slave.
And why would that be?
Well, poisoning was not unknown in Africa. As a matter of fact, it was pretty widely used by so-called conjuring men. We call them witch doctors, but they were called conjuring men. And in a very interesting book, Murder at Montpelier, written by Douglas Chambers, he talks about the first case in which a master was poisoned by slaves. And that was actually the grandfather of James Madison, President James Madison. And his name was Ambrose Madison. And this was in 1736. And a slave named Pompey was actually hung for poisoning Ambrose Madison. Now, poisoning wasn't quick. You didn't give it to him and he just dropped dead. In many ways, it looked like it could almost be something else because it kind of ate at them for days, weeks, sometimes even months. And it was kind of an agonizing death. And 2 other slaves were also convicted in that. And the record is kind of sketchy, so they were only whipped. They weren't actually executed. But you had 3 slaves to some degree involved in this. But as I say, poisoning was mostly slave on slave, and as you had new conjuring men arising in the New World, they were trying to consolidate their power among the slaves, and most of the slaves in Virginia at that time, according to Chambers in his book, were from eastern Nigeria. And so this was a well-known practice that was brought from eastern Nigeria into Virginia in the early 1700s.
Now, when it comes to poisoning, was there any specific type of poisoning being used?
Well, it was local herbs and things that were found here in Virginia, like hempweed and things like that. But as I say, it was just the very knowledge of these herbs and roots and so on that gave these conjuring men their power. And then, of course, they dress it up with, rituals and symbols and charms and so on and so forth.
Because when you think about just different herbs and all, you wouldn't really expect it to be too poisonous, but like you said, obviously a knowledge in herbology would be more than enough to go ahead and take the good from the bad and the bad from the good. And so in looking at poisoning, obviously this is an issue that it would create fear. And with 180 slaves being hung.
And they weren't just hung. There was another slave named Peter in 1737. He had his head cut off, and then they put his head on a pole in front of the courthouse to discourage others. And then there was a slave named Eve in 1746 who attempted to murder her master. Actually, he lived, but they burned her alive. So the punishments are actually getting pretty medieval.
Well, it certainly makes you, I think, a little bit more appreciative for the 8th Amendment nowadays. No cruel and unusual punishment, although in some cases you might want to bring those back if you want to try to deter criminals. And so, considering the number of slaves in Virginia, if 180 are being executed, theoretically, it worked, at least, because we don't hear too many stories of extreme murders like this. Would you say, or would you say, well,
I guess if you were one of the victims, you could say it didn't work well enough.
No, not well enough, no. Certainly not well enough. Now,
but certainly, not all murders had to do with slavery. I mean,
sure.
A lot of things were for personal reasons. And in those days, as today, you had celebrity murderers. Mm-hmm. And one of the big celebrity murder cases in colonial Virginia was the trial in 1766 of Colonel John Chiswell. And John Chiswell was the colonel in the militia. He was a large landowner, and he had married into a very well-known and wealthy family. He was a huge landowner himself. He was a friend of the royal governor. So he was very well connected and very well known in the colony. And he got to be better known because he went out to Cumberland County to do some real estate business. And he concluded his business and he adjourned to the tavern that night. And so the tavern was full of people he knew, and one of these people he knew didn't like him very much. He'd had past dealings with him, and this was a fellow named Robert Rutledge. And the problem was that Rutledge was drunk. And he wasn't just a little drunk, he was very drunk. So when Colonel Chiswell walks in, he comes up to him and he throws a glass of wine in his face. Well, Chiswell had a pretty short fuse.
I would imagine.
So he runs over and he gets a pair of fire tongs and he's going to lay Rutledge out. Well, the others in the room kind of restrained him. So he calms down. Then he runs over and he gets a candlestick and he's going to bash him with that. So once again, they restrain him. So after a couple more of these incidents, who should show up? It's the sheriff. So the sheriff says, okay, Colonel Chiswell, you got to leave. So Chiswell goes out. And everybody thinks, well, that's the end of it. But he comes back with a sword. And he said, I'll run any man through who tries to stop me. So he and Rutledge began to exchange words again. And finally, Rutledge calls Colonel Chiswell, you Presbyterian fellow, you. And that's too much.
Doesn't seem like that much of an insult.
Yeah, it does. It seems a little mild. So anyway, at this point, Chiswell runs him through the heart, and he falls dead in front of a room full of people and the sheriff. Now, you'd think this was an open and closed case.
Well, it would seem like that.
But in the preliminary examination, Chiswell's defense attorney says, oh no, my client didn't have anything to do with this. The drunken Rutledge threw himself on my innocent client's sword, so he committed suicide.
Of course he did.
Well, the examining judges were having none of this. They said, we're going to bind Colonel Chiswell over for trial in Williamsburg before the governor, because the governor was the only man who could pronounce a capital sentence. So he was to go to Williamsburg without bail, sit in jail in chains, and await the governor's pleasure. So they sent Colonel Chiswell with a deputy from Cumberland County in the west towards Williamsburg. Well, news of the entire incident had spread among Virginia's elite, and the governor dispatched 3 of his friends, who were all members of the Virginia High Court, who met the deputy sheriff and the prisoner on the road to Williamsburg. And they had a little impromptu trial in the saddle. And they said, well, let us hear the evidence. So they heard the evidence and they said, well, you've got to release this man on bail. And so they released Colonel Chiswell on bail, and he returned to Williamsburg to the comforts of his townhouse in the company of his 3 friends, the high court judges. And, you know, this was kind of disturbing. But it probably all would have been swept under the rug, except an individual by the name of Robert Bowling brought the entire thing out in the Virginia Gazette. And he said, well, how is it that the governor's friends don't have to obey the law and the rest of us do? So this became like the crime of the century, and it all kind of boiled down to equality before the law. And so you had ordinary Virginians, you know, getting ready to revolt, and the governor was getting pretty nervous because, you know, tempers were really flaring. And they were saying, you know, we need to bring down this corrupt establishment and have equality before the law. None of this, your cronies can murder any of the king's subjects they want and just waltz off to the comforts of their townhouses. Well, the trial never came before the governor because either he had a nervous breakdown or his friends pressured him, but Colonel Chiswell committed suicide. But this wasn't the end of it, because a lot of Virginians didn't think he was really dead. They thought this was just a ploy by his friends to smuggle him out of the colony. So when his funeral cortege was going to its burial place, it was stopped by a mob. The coffin was pried open. They examined the body to make sure that it was Chiswell and that he was dead. And only at this point did they let it pass on.
I'm just waiting for the stake through the heart just to make sure he's dead.
So this was kind of the O.J. trial of Colonial.
I was thinking the same thing. This is O.J. Simpson or Robert Blake right there with the whole issue of equality in the law. But you know, the amazing thing about equality in the law is that it really wasn't equal under any sense of the phrase whatsoever. I mean, you think about law and order and justice during this time. If you wanted to commit a crime, do you know who's the best person to commit the crime in front of?
Who?
Slave.
I know I was that.
'Cause slaves can't testify. A slave is not the rules in Virginia were actually very well written out about slavery testimony. A slave could testify against a slave because that's obvious, but a slave was never permitted to go ahead and testify against a white man. But what if you were a freedman? Well, freedmen were not allowed to testify against a white man, but they could testify against a slave. And so Virginia's code was very much determined that that only way you could testify is if you were a white person on a white person, but you also had to physically be there. And so for Virginians, when it came time to rewrite the legal code, it was necessary to ensure certain protections. And the protections that had to be cited specifically were, we can never allow a slave to testify against us, because a proper house slave has the ability to go ahead and walk about a room undetected and unnoticed. But the second you put up your saucer for, say, a refill, or if you go ahead and have a need, there they are. And so their ability to hear things and to know what's going on is always there. And so this became a big issue. But even more interesting is that it's the person who wrote those slave laws.
And who was that?
George Wythe.
Now, isn't there a famous murder case involving George Wythe?
There is a famous murder case that there's a book about. And George Wythe, just to give you a bit of background, because this is a name that most people might not have heard of. And in Old Town Alexandria, there's a street named after him called Wythe Street. And if you go to Colonial Williamsburg, there's the Wythe House. And if you're in Richmond, there's the Wythe Home as well. And so George Wythe is basically the first real American lawyer of the nation. In fact, he's so highly respected. He's greatly loved. He's greatly admired. He's the mentor to Thomas Jefferson. He's the mentor to Henry Clay. He's the mentor to so many famous Virginians from the Revolutionary era through to the early Republic, that this is a man who could have potentially have risen up to Attorney General if he wanted the position, but he never did. But George Wythe's knowledge of the law was certainly undeniable. He wanted to be part of the American Revolution, but wasn't able to because he was too old. So it was said that when the British were in the area, he grabbed his gun, he shot at him, and said, "Now I've been in the war." And then he went home. One shot, and then I'm done. But George Wythe was interesting because after Virginia was declaring itself independent and it had its own government, it was Wythe, Jefferson, and Pendleton who worked together to revise the Virginia Code. Now, it used to be that almost every crime under the book, I mean, think about it. For instance, let's say you stub my toe. Well, that's 50 lashes. You cut a person off in traffic. Well, that's about 100 lashes.
Now, that one should come back.
Well, that wouldn't be that bad. Let us say, for the sake of argument, you took a person's handkerchief. That's a hanging offense.
Wow.
Okay.
That's pretty harsh.
Why don't you go ahead and list 5 crimes off the top of your head, and I can tell you what that would be.
Stealing a
hanging.
Pig.
Hanging.
Stealing a horse.
Hanging.
I don't know.
Doesn't matter. You name it, almost every crime you can think of is a hanging offense.
And why is that?
Because
they didn't want to pay for jail?
Well, pretty much. You don't want to pay for jail. It's obviously you're an evil person if you're doing it. You must be hanged. In fact, the story of breaking and entering is of a little boy who saw a loaf of bread he desperately wanted, and when he put his hand on the glass broke, and his hand just fell through the open window on top of the bread, and when the owner saw it, he was clearly stealing the bread. And what did they do to that little boy? They hung him.
Wow.
Simple as that, for only the simple crime of wanting a piece of bread. And so Wythe knew this was too extreme, so automatically it changed the number of things that you could be hanged for to very extreme crimes, things like murder. Meanwhile, crimes like stealing was more of a prison sentence. And minor things automatically turn into like a little spell in the stocks, things like that. Now, George Wythe is a very interesting murder because his murder is actually detailed in a book called I Am Murdered, which is by Bruce Chadwick. Now, I Am Murdered is actually a direct quote from Wythe because as the story goes, Wythe, in his, about in his 80s by this point, is a retiring judge in Richmond. And as he's getting ready to have breakfast, his good-for-nothing nephew, a gentleman named George Wythe Sweeney, was staying with him. Now, Sweeney, as was told from the testimony of his freed woman, Lydia Broadnax, who was basically the housekeeper, and she said Sweeney had a cup of coffee and made a huge show and production of drinking it. But before he was leaving, he was dumping something in the coffee and throwing paper into the trash. Then, when she took the judge his coffee, He drank it slowly, and this is a very routine dictated man. And what happened was that as he was having his coffee, all of a sudden he had some very violent attack of stomach illness, violent vomiting. Now, Broadnax and another young man who was his new protege at the time, both had the coffee as well. Both became violently ill. Wythe reportedly ran downstairs, went in to see his housekeeper, unaware that she was sick too, and had shouted out, "I am murdered," realizing he's been poisoned. Well, Wythe would go ahead and suffer for about a week before he finally passed away. His protege died almost within a day. Lydia Broadnax, the only one to survive the attack. No one's 100% sure why she survived. But Wythe spent about a week in agonizing pain. 3 doctors come to visit him. All of them are saying he's got a bowel obstruction. It's not poison. It's not until after the death that they start to recognize it could be arsenic or any other kind of poison. Well, before George Wythe dies, he gets a little bit of a last laugh. He changes his will to prevent Sweeney from getting all the money.
So he suspected Sweeney.
Well, he suspects Sweeney, and a lot of friends had warned him that something was wrong because Sweeney was notoriously known for gambling debt. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of murder and a lot of crime happened in Virginia, because Richmond was notoriously known for its casino gambling. And so Sweeney most likely did this as a crime of passion, specifically in order to get Wythe's money. Now what happens is that Wythe lingers for about a week, and basically his stomach lining is deteriorating, and the acids are now going to eat the internal organs of his body. And when he finally does die, everyone in Richmond says it's Sweeney. Everyone knows this is it. And so everyone's waiting for the trial. This is the trial of the 19th century. Thomas Jefferson is watching. John Marshall is watching. You've got all the big names, and in fact, Sweeney gets the best defense team in the nation, in the history of the nation. He's got Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General, and William Wirt, a man destined to become the longest-serving Attorney General in the nation's history, as his defense team. And they rip the prosecution's case to shreds, pointing out, you can't have Lydia Broadnax come in. She's a black woman testifying against a white man. George Wythe came up with that law. You can't go ahead and look at this, the possibility of him poisoning him, because the poison being used was ratsbane, rat poison. Everyone has rat poison. It's one of the most common things. You could go into any apothecary shop and buy a bag of it, and nobody would question your reason. Every conceivable thing that could have happened proved this is a man who, if you follow the evidence trail, couldn't have done it. The doctor's testimony even said as much. And so, while common sense said he did it, here's the defense saying he couldn't have. And so automatically, Sweeney is able to get off with murder. He ends up leaving Virginia. According to reports, he goes to Kentucky, ends up meeting his own fate, being killed due to trying to get out of the gambling debt. And most people in Virginia figured this to be justice served, just a little bit late. But it was a sensationalized murder, one that absolutely stunned the state, and certainly showed that within Richmond and Virginia itself, there's an issue with crime and gambling and murder that needed to be addressed. And sometimes laws need to be revised. It's just that we didn't go about revising them.
Well, speaking of ne'er-do-well nephews, didn't Thomas Jefferson have some nephews who were involved in a murder?
He did. There was a case of murder right in Tennessee, right along the Mississippi River, nearby the city of Missouri, called New Madrid. And what happened was that he had 2 nephews who were rather drunk quite a bit of the time. They were very brutal, and they had viciously murdered one of their slaves. Now, realizing that what they'd done was technically against the law, because some people said slaves have no rights, therefore their murder doesn't count for anything. What they realized was they had to get rid of the evidence, and so they cut the slave body up, they threw it into the fireplace, and they wanted the body just basically burned and destroyed. Well, a small problem about this murder is that it occurred the same night as the famed New Madrid earthquake, an earthquake which reached about 8.2 on the modern Richter scale, and whose aftershocks could reach all the way out to Boston, and through those shocks alone, ring the church bells. And so as such, what happened was the earthquake, being so violent, so devastating, knocked down the chimney. put out the fire and the body never burned. And so, because he was their slave, the police knew automatically they did it. But we could probably sit here for
And so
an
what
hour
happened
on
to them?
Well, they were arrested, they were put on trial, they were hanged, and so certainly they did not have a fun time.
So justice was done.
It was eventually done. But we could talk about crime, punishment, murder for hours on end. But unfortunately, our time is coming soon enough to a close. And so when we think about crime and punishment in Northern Virginia and all Virginia as a whole, there is quite a great deal of it. Come visit us at our website, www.timetravel21.com, or email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com to learn more about crime, murder, punishment, law, and order in Colonial Virginia and other times during our past. This episode brought to you through the Margarita and Donald J. Metzger Foundation grant, and we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Virginia Time Travel and look forward to seeing you once again.